Hello, I'm Kevin Rogers. Welcome to Reasonable Faith Adelaide. Tonight we have Tom Daly, who's going to speak to us on scientism and scientific naturalism and examination. So thank you, Tom, and I hand it over to you.
Thanks, Kevin, and welcome, folks. Whether you're on the Zoom or watching later, um, I'm delighted to actually figure out how. Oh, I see. Hang on, I've got to actually accept the recording. Here we go. I was about to say I'm delighted to figure out how to actually swap the slides. Oh, there we go. Look at that. So I'm delighted to be able to actually give this talk this evening, um, because it's forced me to think, organize my thoughts around a topic of that I've long thought about. And you'll see as I go through that there's things that I'm picking from a good part of my experience, not as a young man anymore, but through my journey. Sorry, somebody? No, no. Anyway, and so here's what we're going to cover. Here's the ground we're going to cover. We've had on the list of topics that Kevin organises each year a set of front foot topics. So I'm going to talk about what that is and a little bit about how I see apologetics. And that'll lead into why this talk. And then we're going to get into definitions and backgrounds of scientism and philosophical naturalism. It's got a dozen different names. We'll go through that, and I'm going to use some of them interchangeably, somewhat deliberately. We're going to examine the necessary and implied beliefs of scientism or scientific naturalism or materialism, and then also a few typical beliefs. And then we'll look at the practicalities of what does that mean. And I want to sort of end with some concluding thoughts that hopefully are useful and encouraging, ideally. So the aim here is, and this is part of what the front foot topic means, but it's really to explain why Christianity is reasonable after all, when in our rich Western cultures, it's been assumed that it's not really a reasonable option for thinking people. And I want to challenge that by looking at the materialist option to a faith in some transcendent God. Now, I'm going to talk about Christianity because I am one, but I also recognize from this talk that this talk in no way really is going to get you to Christ, the Son of God. It's only going to get you to some questions about whether there's some transcendent or not, some transcendence or not. And I'd like to follow Tom Holland, a historian, author of Dominion, which is a tome that I have not yet read, but I've listened to Tom talk a lot. And he said something when I was listening to him a little while ago, talking to Douglas Murray and who else I've got it there, Stephen Meyer. He said, most people in the West believe in human rights, but human rights don't exist objectively. I mean, they're as fantastical as believing in angels. And I guess that's sort of the argument that I want to make tonight by exploring the materialist or scientific naturalist position. But first, front foot topic. What do I mean by that? Well, so if apologetics is giving a defense of the hope that we have from 1 Peter 3:15, and to do it with gentleness and respect. And I'm going to talk a little bit more about Peter Singer and John Lennox later in the talk. But this is a fantastic talk. John Lennox talking to Amy Orr Ewing. and he talks about his conversation with Peter Singer. If not now, maybe during the Q&A, we should talk about that. But it really is an example of doing apologetics. And for anybody who's listened to John Lennox, Professor John Lennox, they'll know that he argues his position with gentleness and respect. And that's what I hope to do tonight. I'm sorry, I'm not the gentleman that he is, and I'm not anywhere near as smart as he is. So you've got me with my foibles. But just know that if you've listened at all to John Lennox, he is probably one of my heroes of apologetics. But to go on, the purpose of apologetics, as far as I understand, is to break down the barriers of unbelievers. The passion that I have is to, and Bronwyn, you know this, I think we share this, is to build up the faith and encourage particularly young believers, so that so that we can actually increase the intellectual burden of our kids and our grandkids, or make it harder, or at least less easy for that 90% of kids that you said give up their faith a couple of weeks ago, Bronwyn, that the stats. I want to make it less easy for them to walk away from their faith by knowing actually there are good reasons and good arguments for the faith that they've actually been perhaps raised up in, or considering, or considering jettisoning. So that animates me, and to somewhat recapture the fact that if you listen to John Dickson, historian theologian John Dickson, or Tim Mackey, Bible Project, you know, they stress that being a Christian is such a history of being a learner. A disciple means learner, not just follower, but learner. And I guess that's what I'm trying to engage in and add to the conversation of. So front foot topics. Well, surely part of a defense of our faith has got to be an examination and an awareness of the alternatives and the implications of the alternatives. And I find that most of the times when we're doing apologetics, we're defending, you know, why this isn't a contradiction in the Bible, or why the Bible might be historically true, or why Jesus did claim to be the Son of God. We're always sort of on the back foot. I want to go, hang on. There's no neutrality here. Like, nobody gets to be in a place where they don't get to decide. And we need to be aware of the options out there. And I think there's great examples of this. Paul spoke Greek to the Greeks, and he debated philosophy with the philosophers. He called on Roman law. And out of that, by the way, we got the book of Romans. I don't think we'd be without that, right? I think our faith lives would be impoverished without that. But he couldn't do that unless he's examining the options. Now, okay, he came from that background. He was calling on his background, but he was still critiquing the options. And that's what I want to do tonight. That's what I mean by front foot topic. Let's critique some of the options and some of the implications of the options to Christianity, or at least to theism, as I'm doing tonight. And, you know, Christianity was not birthed, nor did it grow in a bubble. And I guess I'm trying to add to that debate, and that's what I mean by front foot topic. But as I was preparing the slides, I realized that this actually gave me a little bit of an opportunity to indulge myself and tell you why, how I got into apologetics, and why I was pretty rapt to discover from my son the existence of a local chapter of Reasonable Faith. Thank you, Kevin. It was actually an act of humility for me getting into apologetics. I admitted to myself, honestly, that I might be wrong. And maybe God didn't exist. And of course, then he didn't have a son, right? That follows. And I was confident from my existing knowledge that God, if he existed and created the universe, etc., maybe the multiverse, I'd sort of bet that he wouldn't be too threatened by little Tom Daly asking some difficult questions, right? I figured he could probably handle it if he existed. And if he didn't exist, well, no problem, right? Well, at least a different set of problems. And of course, very much, I guess I was taking, I was taking my cue there from the book of Job, where Job spoke rightly and his friends who sort of were giving a touchy-feely God and, were not really seen as doing the right thing. So when I was working, had this come about? When I was working and living in the US, where it was said that Bible study in the Bush White House, it wasn't quite mandatory, but it wasn't quite not mandatory. And so I was one of those who went through the hanging Chad and the Florida elections and stuff, and it was quite a show for us Aussies in the US with that election. I can't remember exactly what year it was now, maybe 2000 or whatever. But I couldn't understand what flowed from that. How, and I'm not arguing anything. I'm just telling my story because I know that there are some people here that have some strong different feelings than mine. But I'm just telling you how I got into apologetics. I couldn't understand how folks that I was reading the same Bible with and in the same Bible studies could justify, a trumped up, and irony intended there, Iraq invasion claims, weapons of mass destructions. I watched Richard Butler say on CNN that, what are you going to do when you find out there's no weapons of mass destructions? I saw the Fallujah killings. I experienced the want after September 11 to punish somebody, to get vengeance on somebody. I experienced it at the boys' soccer games. I experienced it at church. And a lot of my good friends left our church. And then there were a number of years later, back in Australia at lunch, I watched a Christian friend berate a secular scientistic friend. And it really occurred to me that I actually looked pretty unflattering, pretty unattractive, like my Christian friend, who, by the way, is a wonderful guy. But I just went, if I look like that, I need to have the humility to actually ask, am I potentially wrong? And listen to somebody else's words. Now, as it happens, it's been one of the biggest blessings is to actually question my faith. So as part of that, I have so many. I'm not in a church bubble like a lot of my pastor and church friends. Part of me is still in the Bay Area. I work and lived there for so long. I have so many friends that are so anti-church, anti-Christian, anti-faith, and violently so at times. Not violently, but strenuously angry, still angry. And they hold to scientism or a scientific naturalism, and they never question their assumptions. They never question its implications, its consistency, its livability. And so they hold strong beliefs that Christian beliefs are fanciful and harmful. And the purpose of this talk tonight is to examine some of those, somewhat objectively, though I'm a committed Christian. And it really is that scientism and naturalism are so influential in our culture and so unexamined. It's in the air we breathe. It's in social media. It's in the talk shows. It's in our, as I said, within our kids and grandkids' generations. But how does it look today? It doesn't look like Richard Dawkins today. It looks like a Ricky Gervais, or it looks at the morning show hosts, right? But Ricky Gervais catches it really well. You know, he's having a debate on the Tonight Show or one of the US shows. Christians have faith, but we, and it's implied, smart atheists have facts. And this is my workmates. This is their belief. I just lack a belief in God. I don't have faith. I just lack a belief in God. And you believe in those thousands of gods, but I'm reasonable. I just don't believe in just one more, because after all, I'm rational. And Ricky Gervais is quite correct. Nobody can prove God exists. But similarly, what Ricky doesn't talk about, and similar folks don't talk about, is that nobody can prove God doesn't exist. Nor can they actually prove many of the beliefs they hold. And nor can you prove so many of the beliefs of scientism. So now I've used these terms. Let's get on and define them. Scientism, the opinion that science and scientific method are a hard scientism. It means that it's the only way of knowing about reality. And it's a way of getting rid of the supernatural and saying pretty much what Ricky Gervais is saying. You have faith, but I have facts. I first heard the term in a Veritas Forum podcast, and I had this link. Now I'll post the slides on SlideShare after the talk, as I normally do. And scientism, I first heard from Professor Ian Hutchinson, who's a professor of nuclear science at Stanford. I think he was at the time. I think he's at MIT now. And it really is a matter of saying that science is the only way to knowledge. And the terms are ascribed to Tom Sorrell, who I know less about, but certainly Professor Ian Hutchinson on a Veritas podcast is where I first heard the concept. And I think he does a really good job of summarizing pretty much the problems that Ricky Gervais is leaving unexamined. But there's a real hard edge to scientism. Philosopher Alex Rosenberg has really embraced it. And you'll see from his quote there's no deeper explanations than those that science provides. And he's a little bit like, he's doing the same thing in that interview and in his paper and publications, some of which I've read, but again, I have the links here. I'm trying to give you references for everything. But Stephen Hawking and Leonard Mlodinow in The Grand Design, they basically say that philosophy is dead. A little bit like Lawrence Krauss. Philosophy is dead. It's now over to us science to give you the meaning of life, the universe, and everything. And we'll find all this out as part of our quest for the grand unified theories. And the ironic thing that William Lane Craig points out about this book, The Grand Design, by Stephen Hawking and Mlodinow, is that they basically go on to say philosophy is no longer needed. And then instead of a book of science, they go on to write a book of philosophy. And the whole time not realizing that that's actually what they're doing. We'll return to that a little bit later on. We're doing definitions right at the moment, right? So I'm using a few terms interchangeably. Scientism is the principle that science is the only way to true knowledge. But scientific naturalism has a couple of guises. One is methodological naturalism. And frankly, when I'm doing tech and actually doing any sorts of empirical research, whether it's AI or whatever, I'm employing the methods of naturalism. I'm looking for answers and information and knowledge from within the natural world. And I'm making the assumption that that's accessible within the natural world. And so I'm doing I'm really in the sphere of methodological naturalism. Methodological naturalism doesn't compete at all philosophically with Christianity. It's a method, as the name suggests. Philosophical naturalism or ontological naturalism or scientific naturalism, I think scientific realism, for a more modern term, they all imply something close to scientism. And for this talk, scientific naturalism equals materialism, philosophical naturalism, ontological naturalism, that essentially there's only this universe or the multiverse, and the only things that exist are space, time, matter, and energy. That's what we're talking about. So when I say materialism, naturalism, ontological naturalism, scientific naturalism, scientism is the way to get the knowledge about only those space, time, matter, and energy. I'm hoping this is making sense so far. There's some further background here, which is really fascinating. William Lane Craig touches on this. I think at times he might go a little far from some of the critiques I've been reading in the last couple of weeks of William Lane Craig's time and space, some of his response to the A and B theories of time, and he does talk, and it is very interesting to talk about how logical positivism, which originated both in Germany and in Austria in about the 1920s, and came to vogue and was quite an influential thesis or theory of knowledge, and its associated verificationism right up to about the 50s. And the idea was that if you can't prove it in a test tube by observation, then you're not making any sense. Supernatural doesn't exist. Miracles can't exist by definition. God can't exist by definition. Nothing beyond the empirical world exists by definition. And it was an attempt to ground philosophy in empirical science and refute the supernatural. And it was interesting because it largely died in the 50s and 60s for good reason, which we'll touch on a little bit in a minute. But it was heavily criticized by somebody like Karl Popper. Karl Popper gave us the falsifiability concept of science, so that something, if it's not falsifiable, then the theory isn't science. And that's been used quite a lot in conversations with the intelligent design folks, right? But it's really interesting because somebody like Sean Carroll, who's a particle physicist and he actually and a multiverse and string theorist supporter, for those of you who follow those things, and in fact, a lot of scientists who support string theory and the multiverse, it was convenient a while ago to actually quote Karl Popper that if something's not falsifiable, then it's not science. But when the multiverse and even inflation and a few of the other theories now start to not be falsifiable, both in theory and practice, then they're not so keen on Karl Popper's definition of something being science, his differentiation. Anyway, as I said, and I'll speed up a little bit here, but scientism lives on in the form of scientific realism, and it lives on in our culture. It really died in the 50s and 60s. And here's one of the reasons, and some examples. Here, quoting Tim Keller, one of my favorite theologians and cultural analysts. The declaration that science is the only arbiter of truth is not itself a scientific finding, it's a belief, which is pretty important for this evening's talk. But let's take that a little bit further to try and explain, or to try and highlight. And I think I got this idea from J.P. Moreland, philosopher and apologist from Biola. The written claim that Tom Daly, me, can't write a sentence in English is obviously self-contradictory, right? Because I've just written a sentence. That very claim is a sentence written in English. So it's obviously self-contradictory. I hope that's clear. So similarly, the claim, science and the scientific method are the only way to render truth about the world and reality, is self-contradictory, because that itself is not a scientifically provable true statement. Just in the same way as the first statement, the first sentence is self-contradictory. So anyway, scientism died, but it lives on. So, and this is the main part of my talk. This is really the bit I wanted to convey. Everything else is background. What are the implied and unexamined beliefs from scientism, scientific naturalism? Number one, that space, time, and matter and energy, they are either created from absolute nothing, or they've existed past eternally. And there's a couple of problems with that. Let's consider the first bit. Is you take the claim of everything created, nothing created everything. And you've got people like Lawrence Krauss, Universe from Nothing, or Stephen Hawking in the aforementioned The Grand Design. Their nothing is essentially the quantum flow, the law of quantum mechanics, of gravity, and their nothing has both something in terms of physical things in the quantum phone, and virtual particles coming in and out, energy potentials. Those are all not nothing, but neither are the rules, the laws. They all exist. In Stephen Hawking, because there is such a thing as gravity, because there exists such a thing as gravity, the universe can and will create itself. Well, where did gravity come from? So it's not nothing. It's not what most people would regard as the absence of anything. But Dr. Peter Atkins has a different nothing. He actually says, no. Stephen Hawking, and Peter Atkins is a chemist, and he's written a number of books on this, and he's been the former chair of the British Humanist Association, I think. And he's very influential, and he's a smart guy, but he's an angry atheist as well, and that matters, and I'll tell you why in a minute, or we'll look at why. But he says, no. Stephen Hawking and Lawrence Krauss are wrong. No. Everything is very, very simple. Nothing. The absence of anything is very, very simple to understand. And so the transition from nothing rolling over into something is also a very, very simple transition. And when I heard him talking to John Lennox, Professor John Lennox, and explaining his thesis here, what my father said came back to me from when I was a young boy. He said, well, son, but even when really smart people talk garbage, it doesn't make it not garbage. Because, as William Lane Craig put it much better than me, Dr. Peter Atkins here this is a belief in magic. But William Lane Craig sort of shaking his head, he goes, and you guys have probably heard him, at least when the magician pulls the rabbit out of the hat, you have the magician and you have the hat. But here, this is worse than magic. And it's a belief. That's the point. It's a belief. The other part of the universe, which is often a surrogate for materialist, naturalist God or belief, is that space, time, and matter and energy, time, space, matter, and energy, have existed past eternally. And it's generally agreed, there are scientific and philosophical challenges to that. Generally agreed that most cyclic models, where the universe is expanding and then contracting for an infinite amount of time, don't work, because they actually lose energy over time. And there's not really been a model put forward that hasn't then by other scientists been discounted, Sean Carroll had one with quantum loop gravity a little while ago, and even that he doesn't seem to talk about anymore. There's the expansion of the universe, which Einstein himself resisted initially due to his beliefs, but then went on to recall that's the issue around the cosmological constant that he added to his field equations. And there's the success of general relativity itself, which shows that there's very likely to be a beginning of our universe. And for those who know about multiverses and inflationary models, then there's the Born-Guth-Vilenkin model that says, in fact, actually, the multiverse is likely to have been expanding as well. And therefore, any multiverse or any universe that has been it has been expanding for a period of time is more than likely, from the maths, to have actually had a beginning. So it's very hard to get a past eternal space, time, matter, and energy from our current best physics. And if you believe in a past eternal space, time, matter, and energy, then you're believing that someday science will have some breakthrough or some overturning of the current science to make this possible. And there's a philosophical problem with this too, which I'm going to attempt to explain, but I never know whether I do this very well. I always think about this. If you want to travel to Adelaide from Largs Bay, I'm at Largs Bay, it's going to take you about 30 minutes. But what if you wanted to get to Adelaide from Sydney? Well, it's going to take you about 24 hours if you're driving. Let's just say driving, right? What if you wanted to get from Auckland? Let's just assume that you could drive from Auckland, and it's going to take you probably 4 days. But what if you wanted to get there from, what if you were traveling from, Mars? Well, it's going to take you a lot longer. What if you were you get the idea, right? So the further and further you go back, the longer and longer it's going to take you to get to Adelaide. But the point is that if you never start, because from whatever point you start at, if you're not starting in Mars, but maybe you're actually starting in Alpha Centauri, I think that's our nearest galaxy, right? If you're starting there, it's going to take you longer. But if you start before Alpha, so whatever point you decide to start traveling from, there's an infinite amount of points before. Now, maybe space is not infinite. We're just arguing that, right? But let's say somebody's counting, or you're trying to count. The same exercise, the same theoretical exercise works. If you're going to count down from 3 to 0, -3, -2, -1, right? And maybe it takes you a second. But if you're an infinite amount of seconds in the past and you start counting down, well, but wherever you start in the past to count down, you can start an infinite number of infinite numbers before that, right? Potentially, and we don't know this yet, we don't know if there's an infinite number of infinities before you can ever start. Essentially, you'd never start. So you could never get to today. So a past eternal time, past eternal space doesn't work philosophically. Now, the best philosophical answer that I've seen to that is, but what if you could count faster and faster or travel faster and faster? But again, you've got to believe that our current science is overturned, because you've got to go past the physical limits. You've got to be able to travel or count faster than the speed of light, which is the speed of causation. And we don't have time to get into that. But or you've got to traverse smaller and smaller increments. You've got to somehow travel in time lengths smaller than the Planck length. And it still doesn't solve the never ever starting problem. So Professor John Lennox, I told you I'm going to refer to the Peter Singer conversation, and here's I don't have the reference here, I'm sorry, but if you look up Peter Singer, who's an atheist philosopher teaching at Princeton, he's an Australian, in debate with Professor John Lennox. Professor John Lennox makes the point that both the materialist and the theist believe in a brute fact. And for the materialist, it's the universe or the multiverse. And for the theist, it's a transcendent mind. And so the materialist believes that matter is primary and that mind is derivative. I think AI should give us a real pause to actually think about that. But for the Christian theist, belief is a mind gave birth to matter. And my point this evening is simply that we can't prove either one, but we can compare them. And it's not lunatic to actually believe that mind came before matter. Well, Sir Roger Penrose has actually suggested a model that he puts forward. It's called conformal cyclic cosmology, for which he agrees there's actually no evidence. But unlike many of his peers, he doesn't believe in string theory or cosmic inflation. Now, that's interesting because he's a scientist saying he doesn't believe in science held by the majority of his peers. Now, you might have heard about Hawking radiation. So it's Hawking-Penrose theorems. Hawking and Penrose work closely together. Sir Roger and Hawking, they actually did a lot of that work together. And atheist philosopher John Gray puts it this way: humans can't live without illusions. And for men and women today, and again, think of the talk shows, not just the scientists, think of the talk shows, but, they have a faith in progress. And that's a really interesting thing to recognize, because if there are limits to our knowledge, limits to our progress, what does that imply? We're talking about necessary beliefs. Just a reminder, where are we? We're talking about necessary beliefs of scientism and materialism. And you've actually got to believe that the information, and here, this is distinct from what Josh was talking about a couple of weeks ago. I can't see everybody who's here, so I don't know if Josh, you're with us. But this is how the information got into the DNA. And here's a quote from Bill Gates. Human DNA is like a computer program, but far, far more advanced than anything we've ever created. He means at Microsoft. And Francis Collins, the former head of the Genome Project and the National Institute of Health in the US, theist, for those who don't know, he basically wrote a book similarly going, how in the heck did this information get into our DNA? And when you understand how the DNA is actually acting like computer code, the AGCT, how that code is actually arranged, and the information that is there to actually produce the proteins and then the subsequent folding, which AlphaGo, the AI program, has just decoded from the chemical structure on how the protein will actually fold, and therefore its physical and chemical properties. They can now predict that with AI, which is awesome. But it doesn't explain how the code got there in the first place. And you basically have a pre-commitment or a belief to naturalism to believe that it got there purely by chance or necessity. And you have to believe that despite every other time that we see knowledge or information in specific information, right? Imagine, rocks left on a hiking trail that form an arrow that show you where to go on the hiking trail, but not rocks just laying around, but specific information. It's always associated with the mind. And as an IT guy, as a nerd, if you like, when I understood the significance of the existence of information and the code in the DNA, I was stunned. Francis Collins says, how can you not worship? This is a scientist. This is a guy who headed the Human Genome Project, of which, by the way, Java was a fundamental part of soul mapping, just for previous conversation. You have to also believe that brain and mind are the same, i.e. that consciousness is a purely mechanical, electrical phenomenon. It's just brain states. It's nothing more. We're moist robots. And you have to believe that eventually it'll be understandable in purely Darwinian evolutionary terms. And therefore, maybe we can replicate it in other substrates. I mean, there's David Chalmers, an Australian philosopher, does a fascinating thought experiment that what if we took out neuron by neuron of our own brains and replaced them with a different substrate? Would we be able to get all the way and still have consciousness? It's a fascinating question. But of course, whatever your answer to that question, it's a belief, because we're nowhere near being able to carry out that thought experiment. And Thomas Nagel wrote a whole book on this. Thomas Nagel is an atheist philosopher, stridently atheist philosopher. And he wrote a book that was pretty unpopular amongst a lot of his atheist peers, Mind and Cosmos. And we actually had a presentation on this years ago about consciousness from, Kevin can remind us who did that a while ago. I can't remember the lady's name. But the subtitle is why the neo-Darwinian concept.
It was Perry Forrester.
Perry, that's right. Thank you, Kevin. Why the neo-Darwinian conception of nature is almost certainly false. And here it's basically why consciousness actually really raises significant doubts. And he goes on to say it would be an advance if the secular theoretical establishment and the contemporary enlightened culture which it dominates could wean itself off the materialism and Darwinism of the gaps. And I thought that was a pretty useful comment from, and I've read this book, by the way. I probably should go back and reread it. It's a fascinating read, just about how complex our consciousness actually is and how little we know about it, despite all of our MRIs and fMRIs. And we are nowhere on the hard problem of consciousness. Similarly, origin of life. We touched on this a little while ago, but you've got to believe the first replicating cell will one day be explained. I don't need to dwell here. Again, a nice quote from Thomas Nagel, basically, who's trying to take a really cold-blooded look at what he's committing to with a purely materialistic view of reality. The transhumanists have a certain hope, and we covered this when I talked about transhumanism, AI and genetic engineering, CRISPR-Cas9. And for anybody who's interested in that, I think that talk is on the Reasonable Faith Adelaide chapter website is still pretty relevant, potentially more relevant. There was an open AI conference yesterday or the day before. You should see the advances there, Kevin. I know you're interested in ChatGPT and OpenAI. There's voice interfaces. There's now voice, and they're using computer vision. It's pretty profound. And I again argue that people don't understand what's not just what's coming, but actually what's already here. But the transhumanists, and I'm on a few of their social media sites and that, they have a belief that we're going to overcome death. For them, it's a way of dealing and getting significance. So again, it's a belief that science and tech will solve our problems. But as we start examining these beliefs as well. So, and Peter, Kevin, you have this clip on with William Lane Craig there, a much younger William Lane Craig, I might add, talking to Peter Atkins, who I mentioned earlier. And Peter Atkins says, well, in pure scientific terms, well, what is it? Do you really think there's anything that science can't prove or won't prove? And William Lane Craig, without missing a beat, says, yeah, logical and mathematical truths. So you have to assume logic to do maths and to get any reason. You have to assume logic and maths to do physics, to do chemistry, to do science. Metaphysical truths that other minds exist. The world wasn't created 5 minutes ago with the appearance of age. And I won't go, for this audience, we won't go too far into that line of reasoning. Ethical beliefs. This is William Lane Craig I'm quoting. You can't show scientifically that the Nazis did the wrong thing. Aesthetic judgments, the good, the true, the beautiful, and the true, remain really forever out of the reach of science and the scientific method. And by the way, I just stop here. I'm not bagging on science. I love science. I hope I'm showing that I'm no Luddite as I'm talking about. I love physics and I love studying science. This is what I spend a lot of my time doing. The maths, unfortunately, is beyond me, but I understand a lot of at a lay level, a lot of the principles. I follow a lot of the conversations. It's a real hobby and it's a passion. So I'm not a Luddite here, guys. I'm hoping even from just some of the references I'm giving you. So this is not a bag on science. Methodological naturalism I talked about earlier is just a gift, I believe, right? So I'm not bagging, and neither is William Lane Craig here bagging on science, but aesthetic judgments, the good, the beautiful, and the true, are beyond the scientific method. And ironically, science itself can't be, we talked about scientism, right? It can't be verified by the scientific method. And science is permeated with unprovable assumptions, beliefs. And one of which, and this talks about Einstein and his verificationism, his logical positivism that we talked about earlier, is the two-way speed of light is assumed in I think in his 1915 paper, or it was potentially the 1905 paper, I can't remember. No, I think it's 1905 special theory of relativity. Einstein just assumes the two-way speed of light is the same as the one-way speed of light. But we've never measured the one-way speed of light, and we can't. And if you want a really fun video on why, there's this channel called Veritasium, an element of truth. And I've given you the link there, and it shows you why we can't, because the speed of light is the speed of causality, why we can't measure the one-way speed of light. We have to measure only the two-way speed of light. Anyway, there are some beliefs that are typically held. So those are beliefs, that's a set of beliefs that are necessarily held by people who hold to scientism or philosophical naturalism, materialism. These are some of the, and just a little bit of an examination of them. Now, these are beliefs that are typically held, not necessarily, but typically held by those who hold a scientific naturalist view. And we're going to look at two, and I'm going to push this a little bit. And I really look forward to people potentially who are watching this on the video, push back and argue with me. I'd like to know the best arguments why these are incorrect. But they typically believe the moral obligations of equal rights and and of human value and dignity and of universal benevolence, even though we'll readily engage, of course, in things like the Olympics and the World Cup of soccer, the Cricket World Cup, which are essentially, they're essentially festivals of inequality. So we need to ask the question of what actually is it that is of equal value within humans. And now I'm drawing on Tim Keller's, and he's drawing on Charles Taylor, a Christian philosopher, Canadian Christian philosopher. I'm drawing on the series from Tim Keller, the late Tim Keller, of questioning Christianity, and the point is that these don't really flow. These values, these beliefs don't really flow from a scientific or a materialist worldview. And in his book, The Reason for God, or the other one, Tim Keller quotes this philosopher, but I got this from Twitter, as you can see, philosopher Vladimir Solovyov. And he's sort of sarcastically summarizing philosophers like Nietzsche, who obviously was very anti-church and very atheist. Charles Taylor, the Christian philosopher. John Gray, who's a practicing atheist philosopher today, wrote the 7 types of atheism. And the historian Tom Holland, who we mentioned earlier, and really he's summarizing Ricky Gervais and the talk show hosts. Man descended from apes, therefore we must love one another. If that's jarring, it's meant to be, because it doesn't flow. And remember that necessarily the scientific naturalist believes necessarily, by virtue of his stated there's only space-time particles matter, he believes that we are simply just particles in motion. Everything else is then subsequent, and it's attributed. It's something that we do because of evolution. So Nietzsche says, it's fine if you want to believe in equal human rights and human dignity, universal benevolence, but he says that you're still a Christian. It's not fine. You're still a Christian. You're just saying you're not. Charles Taylor said, and I won't go into this, it's a subtraction story. We don't have time. I've got to speed up a little bit. We don't have time to go into that. John Gray basically says, no. You should admit these things are illusions, and you should actually embrace your materialist beliefs. And Tom Holland, in his Dominion and in his writings, the historian basically says, well, these things made sense in a Christian culture. These claims don't flow from a materialist culture. So what does this mean in practical terms? And I'll try and just summarize and wrap up here in a minute. Scientism, materialism is not the absence of beliefs. It's a new set of beliefs, and they're based on equally unprovable propositions. And at times, scientism, and materialism, is at times contradictory. And I'm going to argue in the next few minutes that it's not enough to address life's big questions or provide meaning for life's needs. And again, I remind you of Tom Holland. It's no less fanciful to believe in human rights than it is to believe in angels. I was really stunned when I was listening to this atheist back up that claim, and I have the link linked in the earlier slide to that video and podcast. There's no neutral place to stand. Our materialist society, our talk show host, Ricky Gervais, my friends, my atheist friends, my valued atheist friends and anti-church friends, they think that they're neutral, and I'm bringing my biases when I bring a Christian position. And though that too is a commonly held belief, but how could such a neutral place exist given scientific naturalism, because we're all just particles in motion and we're all on the same plane. There's no higher authority. There's no judge sitting in the dock. There's nobody to adjudicate or to give a higher perspective. So on scientific naturalism, there can't possibly be an objective place to stand. But the scientific materialist will say, hang on, religion is just a crutch. You Christians can't handle the thought of non-existence. I got this guy walking over King William Street from one of my good friends and workmates, former workmates, and it bugged me for the longest time. And I realised he's right. He's actually right. The claim that there's the Christianity is just fairy stories for people of faith who are afraid of the dark, and of course there's Marx's opium for the masses, right? And but there's no neutral place to stand. Here's a quote from Aldous Huxley. I had motives for not wanting the world to have meaning and consequently assumed it had none. And I was able, without any difficulty, to find, and given that, I was able to find without difficulty satisfying reasons for that assumptions. The philosopher who finds no meaning in this world is not concerned exclusively with the problem in pure metaphysics. He is also concerned to prove that there's no valid reason why he personally should not do as he wants to do. For myself, as no doubt for most of my friends, the philosophy of meaninglessness was essentially an instrument of liberation from a certain system of morality. We objected to the morality because it interfered with our sexual freedom. We don't have a neutral place to stand. And there certainly is something in what the scientific materialist is claiming. Religion might not be a crutch to me, but it's a hope. And by the way, it's a hope when we've had periods of uncertainty or suffering. It's actually a grain of truth. And I certainly can't prove my faith. And there's smart peoples both sides of this debate. Let's just talk about some common science. This is my list. There's a much larger list. This is truncated. This is just off the top of my head. Popular scientists who are Christians that I listen to: John Lennox, Francis Collins, Luke Barnes, who's an Australian physicist, worked with Hawking, Ard Louis, who's a science popularizer and works, I think, at Oxford or Cambridge in particle physics. Dr. Alison McGrath, who I believe, Kevin, you've actually met, and physicists. Again, some of these guys I listen to. I've read The God Delusion. But apparently the selfish gene and some of that is brilliant. Some of the Out of Eden is really good biology. I haven't read Out of Eden. Sean Carroll, I listen to his podcast all the time. He's a particle physicist out of his university. He's just swapped universities. So I can't quote that. Brian Cox, I think he's a science popularizer in particle physics. Roger Penrose, I talked about earlier, and I've listened to him at length. Actually, I listened to Sir Roger talk to Sean Carroll just a little while ago about his science. There's always background beliefs. You get the same evidence. You get those scientists looking at the same evidence, and some say yes and some say no. The problem of evil and suffering is really powerful these days. It's a really powerful argument and really effective for people in the rich Western world. I've been traveling to Africa quite a bit. Let me tell you, this argument doesn't carry, the argument from pain and suffering doesn't carry anywhere near the weight in the African countries that I've been in Rwanda, in Uganda, in Tanzania, in Ethiopia. It just doesn't carry the weight, and nor has it through most of history, because the assumption has been that if there's a God, if there's something transcendent greater than us, then we need to have the humility to know that God might know more than us and might have good reasons. But in our scientific materialist world, we believe that we should have the answers. And so I think it was C.S. Lewis who said, we put God in the dock. So it's our background beliefs that we should not have to live with suffering. And interestingly, in that interview, that this is now the third or fourth time I've referred to it, and I really recommend it to you, Peter Singer was talking to John Lennox. He actually, Peter Singer, and somebody asked me about this during the quick Q&A, please. But Peter Singer, John Lennox finds out that Peter Singer, whose beliefs are terrible, relates that his parents survived the Holocaust. Peter Singer's hardly starting from a neutral position. Example, Sir Fred Hoyle, who coined the term Big Bang. He basically had this model of the steady state universe, and it was around the time of Einstein and Einstein's cosmological constant, and he turned the term Big Bang. He made it on a radio show, and it was a term of derision that what you think the universe can't be past eternal, like that's just letting God with a foot in the door. So he basically did his science because of his philosophy. And it's an outstanding story of actually watching the science be directed by the background beliefs. And that actually held right up until Edwin Hubble actually made his discovery from mapping the recession of the galaxies. And it was interesting. It was a Catholic priest, George Lemaitre, that actually had the right idea that Einstein's field theory and his theory of relativity implied that the universe, at least our universe, had a beginning point, and that was the Big Bang. So anybody who claims to stand in an objective position, I only have the facts. I'm sorry, Sir Fred Hoyle, Einstein, they show that it's a very hard place to be. So what are the conclusions as I wrap up? And I know I've gone just a little bit over time, but I'm going to wrap up smartly. The reason that smart people look at the evidence and come out in different places is because gaining your faith in Christ, in a deity, in transcendence, or losing your faith in the materialist scientific worldview, it's just a lot more complicated, particularly a lot of the times than we Christians would actually like to admit. But you can still interrogate your beliefs. You can try and discern your own background beliefs and look at your biases. It's hard, but you can try. You can ask if your beliefs are consistent. Like, does the belief in human value flow from your materialism? Nietzsche says no. John Gray, the atheist philosopher, says no. Ask, is your faith livable? Does it give you meaning and purpose? And then do you have to deny something 1 minute and then you need to borrow from somebody else's faith? Like, for instance, you need to deny that there's meaning and purpose and objective morality in the world, but then you've got to borrow from Christianity to say, no, human beings really are valuable and racism is really wrong. And are you willing to embrace the conclusions of your belief? And if not, why not? Like John Gray, who says, I'm sorry, or not Alex Rosenberg, who's a philosopher, I'm getting it mixed up. The philosopher basically says, no, I'm sorry, but there is no meaning in the world. We are just particles in motion. Love is an illusion, right? Then if you're not willing to embrace the conclusions of your beliefs, then why not? And we can compare our sets of beliefs. Does scientism, materialism meet the requirements of life? Does it give you meaning and purpose? And if you have to invent your own meaning and purpose, does it give you resilience? And I've got to tell you, the stats of rich, comfortable kids, particularly in the US, who are suffering mental health and are killing themselves in rich universities. Surely, and Jonathan Haidt does a lot of research on this. Atheist philosopher, social researcher Jonathan Haidt, he looks at this, and as do a number of his contemporaries, and go, no, these things are linked. But dealing with suffering, again, resilience questions. Does it you're forming your identities? Does your materialist particles in motion worldview help you with your identity? Or do you get your identity now increasingly by being a victim or simply associating with a victim? How do you have a concept of justice, either final justice? Does Hitler and the saint of your choice, do they go to the same place? You die, you rot. Is that justice? And how is it justice if we're just particles in motion and everything is determined by the laws of physics? Love is just surely a chemical response to external stimuli. And how do you have hope in the face of sure death? Well, that's the transhumanism hope. And as I really do wrap up, I've got about a couple more slides. And I couldn't help putting in, I read Orthodoxy earlier in the year from G.K. Chesterton. I think he died in the very early 1900s. And when men choose to, at the end of the 1900s, when men choose to believe in God, they don't believe in nothing. They actually seem to be capable of believing in anything. And I think, and I don't want to get too contradictory or turn too many people off here, but when you look at where we are right at the moment in our rich Western societies, I mean, we believe that if I can invent meaning and purpose, that it will somehow be real. That science and technology can solve all of our problems, from global warming to hunger to selfishness to terrorism. Really? That it's fine, you live your truth and I live my truth, and we can operate like that in societies. We believe that, and that objective morality doesn't somehow exist, that men can be women and biology doesn't determine that. And the universe wanted me to be a doctor, go here, travel there, fill in the dot. This is a common one from my friends. They always go, oh, the universe must have wanted me to do it. Oh, the universe aligned to let me do. I often challenge them while we're out fishing. Just replace that and say, my kitchen table, because you're talking about particles and matter in motion. It's the same thing, right? And many more. I think Chesterton was prescient. And my argument is, my realization from doubting my faith is that we have a huge amount of resources from Christianity. Sadly, in the church, myself, we often don't draw on them. But it's the significance of our life. Eventually, we hope that evil will be banished. We have the resources of grace and forgiveness. We have reasons to pursue real justice with real humility. We believe death is going to be defeated. So we can have hope and significance in the light of death. And for significance, I really recommend watching from 1 hour 50 of the video here with William Lane Craig talking to Rebecca Goldstein about significance. It really is quite powerful. And of course, we have the hope of the continuity of love. I want to finish off with this. 2 attempts, I can't count, sorry, I had a third one, I removed it. 2 attempts to paint the picture of the Christian hope, which I don't think we talk about enough. Gandalf from the Lord of the Rings. Gandalf, I thought you were dead, but I thought I was dead. Is everything sad going to come untrue? That's actually the Christian hope. That's one of the reasons I'm not a materialist. And I think this from Dostoevsky, and I'm going to read this and finish with this. I believe, like a child, that suffering will be healed and made up for, that all the humiliating absurdity of human contradictions will vanish like a pitiful mirage, like the despicable fabrication of the impotent and infinitely small Euclidean mind of man, that in the world's finale, or renewing, at the moment of eternal harmony, something so precious will come to pass that it will suffice for all hearts, for the comforting of all resentments, for the atonement of all crimes of humanity, for all the blood that they've shed, that it will make not only possible to forgive, but to justify all that has happened. And, if we watch the news at night, what an encouragement that has to be. Thank you very much, folks, sorry I went over time. I'm
Hi.
done. I'll stop sharing.
Yeah, stop sharing, then.
Sorry about the overtime, but I wanted to get to the conclusions. Sorry about that.
Finally, brethren. Paul often introduces a section called "Finally, Brethren," and keeps on going. So your conclusion is very long, actually.
Sorry about that, folks.
No, that's all right. We'll feel free to enable your microphone so you can participate in the conversation. Right. Now, got a question here why wasn't Albert Einstein and FDR?
Yeah. So this is all to do with, look, if someone brings up Second Gulf War, I have to say, hey, guys, you completely missed previous acts in history. In fact, I was in Israel during Gulf War One. A bit of Scud warfare, shrapnel fired at me. An Australian was in charge of the UN mission to demilitarize Iraq. He resigned after 2 years because the UN just wouldn't ignore the fact that they, time and again, they'd go to a place to inspect something and they'd see trucks heading out another gate. Sorry, it was just ignored. UN, okay, you got what you want. In fact, I blame the first President Bush because he ended the war too quickly and then told the Iraqis to revolt and throw off Saddam Hussein. But it ended it so quickly that the Republican Guard divisions, or one of them anyway, had got loose and escaped. And then, of course, he brutally suppressed both the Kurds in the north and the Shias in the south. So, look, please, Saddam Hussein had to go. I was issued with a gas mask because he'd already gassed some of his own people during the Iran-Iraq war. So, no, he was an evil guy and should have been got rid of by the first President Bush.
So would you say the Scud missiles were weapons of mass destruction?
Well, yeah, that's why I was issued with a gas mask.
Okay.
I'm not going to engage on that.
Look, it's a side issue. It's a side issue. Sorry, you pressed a button with me.
I anticipated that, Steve, which is why I said that I wasn't going to get into that tonight.
All I'm saying, you cannot.
Go for one. But the point was that this was my journey, and I probably took 10 minutes there, and that was indulgent, and I apologize for that. But that was why, and I don't recant. I'm glad I started to ask hard questions.
Yeah, of course. Yeah, and look, and now I'm going off tangent here, but Albert Einstein believed a report. Niels Bohr, Belgian physicist, talked to Otto Hahn, German nuclear physicist, and inferred that Germans are developing an A-bomb, which is exactly what happened prior to 2003. An Iraqi guy would escape from Saddam and say, oh, yeah, I heard this, this, and this. Exactly the same Chinese whispers on the basis of which we now have atomic bombs. So if you're going to blame President Bush, please do the same to Franklin Roosevelt and to Albert Einstein.
I'm not going to buy in tonight, Steve.
We can move on. It's all right.
Yeah, okay, enough said. Yep.
Now, in your review of Stephen Hawking and the grand design, it says that the universe was created by gravity, and so I have doubts on this. As often does gravity provide a basis for spontaneous creation? Is based on the belief that gravitational energy is negative, which seems doubtful. Because what the argument goes is that the sum total energy in the universe is zero, because gravitational energy is negative and all other types of energy are positive. Add them together and you get zero, so the universe was created from nothing. So that's the basis of the argument.
Well, that's Krauss. That's more Krauss, a universe from nothing.
Yeah, but it's still the same. It's often this statement is often repeated by people like Alan Guth.
Alan Guth, yeah. But, it's a belief in negative gravity. That's true.
Yes, the claim that gravitational energy is negative is dodgy.
Well, There are some predictions, and I'm hazy on this, so I'm on the edge of my knowledge here. There are some predictions I think about galaxy formation and some signatures in the microwave background that do add some weight to cosmic inflation. But there's all sorts of problems with it, including how in the heck does it end, right? And in fact, some of the people who helped to create the theory left, and now they actually speak against it. And a couple of the names are just escaping me because I haven't really followed that too much for a little while. I'm just rusty.
Yeah, well, the argument that gravitational energy is negative is based on something as simple as Newton's force equation and his energy equation.
Well, yes, but it's also based on the fact that the Hubble constant, like where the universe is expanding at an expanding rate.
But no, it's got nothing to do with that. It's got nothing to do with that. If you actually see the arguments that are used that say that gravitational energy is negative, it's something. So, like in Universal Nothing by Krauss, he initially starts in his book saying that the gravitational energy being negative is a computational simplification and assumption, just make calculations easy. Then in page 100 of it, he does a switch and says it's not just a convention, and assumes it's not just a convention, but it's a fact. I was working with not a cosmologist, an astronomer at uni, and I mentioned that Stephen Hawking claims that gravitational energy is negative, and his response was, well, Stephen Hawking has lost his marbles, because he thought it was a ridiculous idea. But the argument in Krauss's book is that the 0 point for gravitational energy should be considered infinite separation instead of zero separation. If you assume it's zero separation, then it's positive. If you assume it's infinite separation, then it's negative. But there's no physical experiment that you can actually perform to demonstrate that gravitational energy is negative, because it's a relative quantity. But anyway, that was one of the subjects I actually proposed to consider in the future. But I think the claim that gravitational energy is negative should be looked at a bit more carefully. But people come out and just say it without justifying it.
Yeah, but that wasn't. I actually even wasn't referring to that this evening. I was just pointing out that Krauss is nothing, and Hawking and Mladenov's nothing is not nothing.
Which is the point.
Yeah. But I was just kind of questioning the state. I'm not criticizing you. I'm just saying that this statement that comes out of the grand design needs to be challenged.
Oh, yeah. Well, same as Brief History of Time, which I did read. In fact, I've read a couple of times. The claim that the universe didn't have a beginning by the use of imaginary numbers and sort of rounding off the beginning still doesn't mean there's a boundary. And William Lane Craig makes that point very well. So there's still a beginning, or at least a boundary beyond which the universe didn't exist. So he's tried twice. I guess he's not trying a third time.
Yeah. Now, you mentioned the Bohr-Guth-Vilenkin theorem.
Yeah.
So that basically argues that the universe has a beginning.
The multiverse would likely have.
Well, whatever the sum total of reality must have a beginning. But in Krauss's debates with William Lane Craig, he showed a slide of Guth holding a poster saying, I believe that the universe does not have a beginning. So it seems that Guth was walking away from the Bohr-Guth-Vilenkin theorem.
Yeah, there's been a lot happened since then. Yeah. That's why I was careful with my language. And I said in it, I used the word probably, or it questions whether I didn't state it. I didn't state it like William Lane Craig saying that the Bohr-Guth-Vilenkin theory says
I'm not expecting you to answer this question, all right? I'm making a contribution.
It sounds like Andrei Vilenkin came back and actually sided with William Lane Craig, but it still leaves the philosophical problem as well.
Yeah. Well, all right. Can I finish what I'm saying?
Oh, so I'm sorry.
So in that debate, it gave the impression that Guth was walking away in the Bohr-Guth-Vilenkin theorem. But I actually did some inquiries and asked the question: Does Guth believe in a passage through the universe? And it came back probably no. He still does actually stand by the Bohr-Guth-Vilenkin theorem.
Oh, okay.
Now, so I wasn't criticising you on that point.
No.
But Tom, I will criticise you on another point. You said that the Alpha Centauri was the nearest galaxy.
It's Andromeda. Andromeda. I was sorry. I meant Andromeda. I'm sorry. Yeah.
I think it's a slip of the tongue.
It takes a lot longer to travel from Andromeda to Adelaide than from Alpha Centauri to Adelaide.
Yeah, I'm sorry. I meant, yeah. Oops.
I've just been nitpicking.
Yeah, no, that's fair. I sorry, I got that wrong, didn't I? That's ruined my street cred.
Right, Charles Lakos, would you like to actually talk to your next guy?
You're muted.
Yeah, we can't hear you at the moment, Charles, for some reason. You're unmuted, but we can't hear you speak. In the meantime, I'll read out your comment. It is confusing to look at multiple modern theories from an apologetic perspective. I think it is helpful to consider more basic issues. Polanyi, the Hungarian polymath, considered a number of these issues. Scientists can focus on things we know through sight, but we know lots of other things: beauty, faithfulness, morality. Sam Harris' suggestion about morality doesn't hold water. Polanyi drew attention to the faith trust that underlies all knowledge. It'd be nice if we could actually hear you. So I'm not sure how to take this further.
Is your volume?
Alex?
Is your volume up?
Maybe you got the wrong microphone or something.
Doesn't look muted, but
Well, we might. But once you mentioned we'll type in a message to you.
Yeah.
Give me a few minutes. All right. Have a muck around with it. We'll move on to other comments. Now, I said you made a comment about me regarding OpenAI and ChatGPT. Yes, I am interested in ChatGPT. Well, I can't remember the context of your comment. Tom?
I need to go back to my slides. What was I made
you did comment that you like ChatGPT.
Yeah, I was saying I'm not a Luddite, and I asked you if you'd actually seen the OpenAI developer forum from yesterday or the day before.
No, I haven't.
Really worth watching. Just go and Google for OpenAI Dev Forum. Pretty interesting what they're doing past GPT-4 and GPT Turbo. It's pretty interesting. They're adding vision. They're adding.
Because I just use the unpaid version, and it can be a little frustrating. So it'd be nice to know: is it worthwhile getting the paid version?
You go and look at some of the example apps and some of the things they're doing.
I've got the $40 version, and I think it's pretty good.
Yeah,
so you reckon it's worth me forking out?
$40.
Yeah.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, I'm tempted, but I was going to get rid of my Optus and I was going to try and save $20 or $30 a month on my telecoms and then Optus went out and I went, maybe I can.
Just you do Woolies telco. That's cheap.
Runs off the Telstra network.
Yeah, true.
All right. Yeah. Regarding things that you can't prove, one of the things you can't prove is our perception of colour.
Yeah.
If well, Anne and I both looked at a green car and we made a comment about whether we liked the green. It kind of makes you wonder, well, do we actually see green in the same way? Does Anne and I see green? I believe we do, but it's not something you can prove, really, is it?
Not if you're colourblind, you don't.
I know.
Yeah,
but if you're not colourblind, you can't prove that our perceptions of colour are the same.
Oh, that's what I mean. I think it indicates that their perceptions are probably different. Yeah.
Well, they can be different if you're colourblind, but I actually believe that they're logically you could argue that our perceptions of colour are the same, but it's not something that you can empirically test. Anyway, it's a thought.
It's a really good one for AI as well, right? Because what they're trying to do is they're trying to fit awareness of the world to our AIs, and really colour is an interpretation, just like hearing. Like think of the cochlear ear.
Yeah.
You have to retrain your brain to take the input to actually make words out of it.
Yeah. Mm.
And colour is also not just what you perceive; it's also your aesthetic appreciation for what you perceive.
Yeah.
Which is why different people have different favourite colours, so to speak.
Yeah. Yeah. Now there are comments about the speed of light. Like we cannot test that the speed of light by a direct measurement is done by reflection, and so you can't prove that the speed of light's the same in both directions.
Correct.
But you can actually predict the speed of light from the permeability and permittivity of free space. So it is logically reasonable to assume that it is the same in both directions, even though you can't test it.
We're not saying anything different, are we?
No, I'm not challenging. I'm just making a comment.
Yeah, you can't measure it. It's pretty reasonable. I didn't say it was unreasonable to expect it.
I do believe it is true that it's the same in both directions.
There you go. So did Einstein.
But I can't prove it.
Correct.
How can I get some of this free space?
What's that?
How can I get some of this free space?
You can get the unpaid version.
Okay.
Yeah, okay. So Charles, how are you getting on?
Well, I've switched. Can you hear me now?
It works now.
Yes.
All right.
Well, it's not the same thing. I've just switched to my iPad. That's all.
All right. Okay.
Yeah. Okay. So I think if you're into an apologetic view, I think all these theories get very confusing. And I think it's actually more helpful to focus on some fundamentals. And I've been reading Michael Polanyi's magnum opus called Personal Knowledge for a year or more, and he tackles a number of things. He was a polymath who died in about 1975. He knew Einstein, and they had an ongoing correspondence over many years. And some of the things that you've already touched on, I raised in my comment, like scientism can't prove everything because it doesn't deal with the things that are fundamentally human, like beauty, the sense of beauty, faithfulness, generosity, and so on. Sam Harris tried to propose a theory of morality based on science, but failed. Really, he just had a different slant on utilitarianism. But the sort of thing that Polanyi was very good at was to point out that science is a very personal endeavor. We don't start just with pure objectivism. There are many things that we know, but we can't talk about. He talks about it as saying we know more than we can say. Like we can know how to recognize a person's face, but we couldn't tell you how we did it. And he tackles this. There's this paradox by some ancient Greek whose name I've forgotten, which basically says you can't discover anything because either you know it, in which case you can't discover it, or else you don't know it, in which case where do you start looking? And he has this very significant theory about what he calls tacit knowledge. And this is the knowledge that we have, but we're not aware of having it. And there are lots of things that we have in our, if you like, in our background, in our context, which we can't identify, but which help us to say, I think this might be a suitable way forward in this scientific endeavour. The other thing that Tom mentioned was we need to examine our beliefs. Well, Polanyi would say we can't. Our beliefs, most of our beliefs are things that we just assume. It's like the water we swim in. We can't examine it. It's just what we build on. And science has a tradition about how you go about things, and you learn from a master how to go about scientific research. You don't just work it out by logic. So one of the things that struck me about all of this is that we miss, or the whole scientism misses the sense of humility, which I think Einstein had when he said the most incomprehensible thing about the universe is that it's comprehensible. And that's an amazing philosophical problem. How on earth does what we see out there match what we think? And I've just been struggling with one of his books, one of his chapters about, what's it called? I think it's, well, I can't remember now, but he made the comment that we come up with these formulae and lo and behold, experience seems to match it. And that's a different way of thinking than to say, my theory tells me what's happening in the world. It just happens that the things that we think about actually has some relevance to reality. And sometimes we, I've lost my train of thought. I'd like to just add one little comment, which is a fascinating little episode when Polanyi presented a paper to a research institute in Berlin where Einstein was in the audience. And it was about what he called the adsorption of gases. And he was rubbished. Polanyi was rubbished because it didn't fit with the current theory of the electron. But 10 years later, they figured out that the theory of electrons was wrong and his theory of adsorption was right. And it's this whole idea of we just don't know. We are finding our way and just trying to solve things by introducing theories of multiverses, which we have no way of testing, just seems to be escaping the problem. Anyway, that's some of what I'm thinking about in terms of Polanyi, and I feel that focusing on the fundamentals is more helpful, I would think, is more helpful for kids to realize what science is about before we start talking about multiple theories about what could be.
Yeah, two comments. Yes. The Question in Christianity series of podcasts that Tim Keller hosted, he actually quotes Michael Polanyi quite a bit, and he talks about tacit beliefs. That's what I'm saying. There's no neutral ground. There's no somewhere from nothing. So that was actually drawing on some of the language actually from Tim Keller and quoting Michael Polanyi. There's also another guy that he quotes as well, who's currently still alive, and I can't remember his name. Sorry, so I quoted Tim Keller.
We just claim that like it's marvelous and miraculous that the world, physics is amenable to mathematics.
I've got nothing to add.
Sorry?
I've lost the connection.
Yeah. I still haven't got my head around it. Do you reckon this argument has much weight which the people who are, say, materialists or atheists, do they consider it a good argument, or do they just kind of brush it off and say it doesn't make sense?
Which part of the argument, Kevin?
The amazement that the laws of physics or that are comprehensible in terms of mathematics. Because I think that was basically what you were mentioning, Charles, wasn't it? Even though we've lost you. Well, anyway, we probably could move on. From Brian. I hear so often from atheists that atheists don't have beliefs, and I've never understood how they can believe that.
Yeah, that's right.
Obvious conundrum in there, but yeah.
Yeah.
Mm.
Yeah. They do. Particularly my Californian friends, they believe they're actually neutral.
Mm.
They believe that. It's good.
They believe, sorry?
They believe they're neutral.
Oh, right, okay.
They believe they have the neutral position.
Mm.
They're neutral on abortion. They're neutral on race. They're neutral on sexuality. They're neutral on politics.
So they have no burden of proof.
Sorry?
They have no burden of proof. That's what they believe.
That was very effective by the new atheists to get in our kids and basically.
I don't have to justify my position because I just lack belief.
Yeah, that's right. It was very effective, and I had to bat that away a lot with my workmates and with my actually with family members. I mean, Sam Harris he provided the wheels for one of my kids to do in their faith for a time.
Mm.
He wasn't the reason; he was just the conduit.
Yeah. On one particular slide, you kind of listed smart people who believed in God and smart people who didn't. On the didn't side, you have Roger Penrose and also Brian Cox. Neither of these people would be what you call new atheists or militant atheists, like people like Richard Dawkins certainly are. But I think it's probably more mild-mannered people.
Yes, but they're atheists and they provide credibility for the talk show hosts, etc. But you're right. They're the Brian Coxes and the I just pick people who I've been listening to recently.
Yeah.
I didn't try and pick militant, but I just try and pick scientists that I've been listening to recently. Yeah. And Roger Penrose, I was listening to him talk to John Carroll. He's most definitely an atheist. You've probably heard him talk to William Lane Craig as well. So,
no, I wasn't aware that. I'll take your word for it. But I kind of got he's pretty open-minded about it. I thought he was more agnostic than atheist, but
maybe, but he believes there's space-time energy and matter. And,
so do I.
And if you just look, and he believes the universe was eternal. That's why he offers up CCC, conformal cyclic cosmology.
Okay. So he is arguing for an past eternal universe.
Yeah, and but remember, he's the guy that gives you all the patterns. He's a brilliant guy.
Yeah.
So some of it is really, really interesting.
Yeah, I believe he gets less credibility than he deserves because he's not in a wheelchair.
Oh, well,
that's a bit rude.
And again, actually, Steve, you almost made my point, of which we can both agree. I have a position because I was in the US listening to Richard Butler. You have a position because you were in Israel and in Iraq and different places, right? There is no neutral place to stand. Now, that doesn't mean that there's not a wrong or right? But it means there's no neutral way. There's no objective way of just looking at the facts without the tacit beliefs. And that I didn't use the word tacit beliefs, but Charles, Tim Keller uses and refers to tacit beliefs. I said background beliefs.
While you were fading away, Charles, I was discussing the statements about the applicability of mathematics to physics and how wonderful that was. And just asked the question whether this argument carries much weight with atheists, or do they just cast it aside?
Charles said he's back to his muted participation.
All right.
One of the things that kicked off the scientific revolution was the belief by committed Christians that God was consistent and therefore we could trust the universe. So science, as we know it, came from that belief that God is, and that God is as we Christians perceive him. If you remove God out of the picture, on what basis do you have to believe that mathematics means anything, that our perception of the universe means anything, or anything else like that?
Well, that seems to be kind of like the starting point. Why start science? That's because you believe in God. And that argument's now being turned around saying, wow, look how well it works. How come? And so that's actually a pointer back to God. Was some people argue it, but I was just wondering how convincing that argument is. The unreasonableness, what is it called? The unreasonableness of...
unreasonable effectiveness of mathematics. Is that Feynman?
Yeah, I think, yeah.
Gentlemen,
No,
I might have to leave the meeting at this point. I've got to be up at about 4:30.
Yeah. Well, thank you very much with your contributions.
I make two observations.
Yep.
And share them briefly. One, I would always, I'm assuming that most of us are Christian, and even if not, never being ashamed of using the word to slightly salt the presentations. And you can do it with a bit of grace and discernment without emptying the salt shaker. So say, for instance, Tom, where you quoted Dostoevsky and there was the other chap, Chesterton. Yeah, or even throughout some of the other slides, I would always slip in a little bit of scripture, either one in a slide, or just if you know it off by heart, or you've written it down off the side. To my mind, it introduces that objectivity amongst Christians and also has a power that is spirit, that is beyond matter. And the second thing, I think I've probably forgotten. What was it? That's right. The new Speaker of the House in the US, Mike Johnson, is apparently a young Earth believer. So that's an entree, an entry point in conversations with people who are political or going to the States. You can just sort of, introduce the cosmology. What is the evidence for this young Earth thing? Because it seemed generally it's ridiculed. So how can some intelligent people believe it? And then you can go off into the because I know very little about the young Earth thing. I'm quite happy with the Earth, the Earth being 4.5 billion and the universe 14 or whatever it is. But if it turns out that the Earth is younger, then I've got no problem with it. But I would just like to be more familiar with how intelligent people could run with that young Earth. Has anyone got any quick answers on?
No such thing as quick answers.
No quick ones.
We're a house divided.
Hey, but we're still a house, eh?
Yeah, but we still get on well with each other. Three of the people that you can see on here are young Earth people, and they're welcome contributors.
Can't see me.
Yeah, put your hands up, identify yourselves. So he knows. All right, see Steve, Brian, and Trevor too. You aren't you? Yeah. So these people support the young Earth view of the world, and So we're a mixture of both, and both views are tolerated, and we live together reasonably peacefully.
That said, if I met somebody who was 6,000 years old, I would not consider that person to be young.
Right? Yes. Fair enough. It's a relative, I suppose. Yeah.
Well, this looks like a tremendous forum for further exploring that. So, like I said, thank you very much for this opportunity to share. I haven't been at Zoom for years. It was really interesting, and I would like to do it again. So, as I shared with you, Kevin, I can be up at 2 a.m., 3 a.m., so long as it's reasonable 6, 7, 8 hours sleep.
And we'll catch up and discuss things further, and probably private Zoom forum.
Okay, not a drum at all.
Thank you.
God bless.
Yep.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thanks, David.
All right. All right. So that's the end, effectively, of the comments. So
there was one more from me in there.
Yeah, what was that?
Just one of the Tom's points towards the end had a list of important points for us to look at. One was to ask ourselves if our beliefs are consistent. And I consider this as one of the most important questions that we have. Truth is always consistent. Untruth is generally not consistent. And of course, consistency doesn't prove truth, but inconsistency does prove we've missed the mark to at least some extent.
Yes.
And so consistency has to be pretty much central.
I think we're basically nodding on that.
Can't argue with that.
Yeah. It's consistency is necessary but not sufficient.
Yeah.
No.
I know for myself,
Yes.
when in apologetics, I often feel that we can't prove God, we can't prove all sorts of stuff, but we can demonstrate that certain things are consistent. And if they're consistent, that's a very strong basis to start from.
I think a lot of the arguments for a God's existence show it's more likely than not. So,
we think so.
Yeah. Sorry?
We think so.
Yeah. So yeah, a lot of what Tom presented today was basically showing that scientism is inconsistent.
Very much.
So what that would show that scientism is unlikely to be true. So there must be something beyond scientism.
Yep.
Yeah, and that was sort of where I got to with apologetics, is because I had the humility to actually stop, because we here probably know more than most the failings of the church, because we've studied history and we've listened to historians and we've had honest conversations, right? But it was an act of humility to me, because to me I felt like I was risking my life, but I wanted to do it because those two things really, really affected me. Don't forget, again, we're in the US for September 11. I was ringing my mate in the building too, who ironically was shutting down the servers so that they actually wouldn't get corruption of the file system. And I know what it was like when my neighbours boarded up their houses. Our church, though, to its credit for the first part, we started taking communion with Afghan bread, because we had the largest Afghan community outside of Kabul, living in Fremont, California, where I lived. And our pastors went and actually spoke to the local mosque. But at the same time, and every truck had a US flag. Every church had a big US flag over it. The Christian nationalism, and it was, we were heading to Romania with our church when the pastor's son-in-law, somebody said, "Oh, and God bless America." And he turned around and he went, I said, "I wish we could stop saying that." And I went, "Oh, mate," I said, "I'm so," because we were treated as US, because we're white, we're English speaking, we were treated as like national. And they would ask, "Why do people hate us?" I'm going, where do you start with that? That would be like trying to explain physics to my golden retriever. There's no shared language to start with. Some of my best friends, they're still good, close friends today. They left the church when the church said, "Hey, we shouldn't be Christian nationalists. We should be Christians first and Americans second." Yeah. That was a sermon they could not handle. The pastors came back next week to a much diminished church and said, "We're really sorry that we upset people," but they went up to the line, but they didn't recant. My friends left. A lot of my friends left. They could not handle the disjoint between the church not being nationalist enough. Yeah. So thank you for indulging me on the story this evening. I was actually hoping it would add to the presentation, the depth of it, but there is no neutral place. There is no neutral.
I liked your comment about humility, because I think that's a good virtue to have if you go into science. Have humility. Like in universities, they theoretically talk about academic reserve. So there's a good academic should be doubting, not overstate their conclusions, and leave out the possibility that things could move on and they are wrong. To be dogmatic and certain of yourself is more a sign of you not knowing.
Yeah, but what if you want funding?
Yeah, that's right.
Sorry?
What if you want funding?
No, that's a different matter. My head of my department said, with any research, the first question you should ask is who's funding it.
Can I
that's
just
a cynical view of the world, Brian. You should be ashamed of yourself.
Can I just tell you an inspiring story to finish off with?
Yeah.
Yes.
That video, and if you look, John Lennox and Amy Orr Ewing is on Premier Christianity last week or whatever. And it's just John Lennox in conversation with Amy Orr Ewing, if you know those folks. And Amy is brilliant. She's brilliant. John Lennox, you know, is brilliant, and he's a humble. Speaks like 7 languages. He's a humble guy, but the story that actually, if I can tell it to you, you should go and watch it. You should really go and Google John Lennox and Amy Orr Ewing. But he tells about he was talking about his debate with Richard Dawkins, and he was talking about Peter Singer. Now, Peter Singer, I've referred to a lot. I don't know if you know Peter Singer. He's an Australian. He's an ethicist, professor of ethics in Princeton. He lectures on it. And he has and John Lennox was really gracious in this interview, and he's talked extreme views, he calls them. I think they're evil views. He basically thinks you should be able to kill a baby with Down syndrome a month after, say, up to a month or more after they're born, because they're not really a full human being. They don't have the cognitive capacity, and it's really not the mother's fault that it wasn't caught in vitro, because overall the mother would have got rid of the kid, right?
That's at least more consistent.
Yeah, he is consistent. He is consistent. That's true. So anyway, so there's a really funny part of it where John Lennox is talking about the history and he asks, you know, Singer says, "Oh, John," he said, "Oh, see, that's the problem. See, your parents were Christian. You just stay in the faith. You're Christian." Yeah, and John Lennox says, "But Peter, I thought you were your parents were atheists, weren't they?" And he said, "Yes." And he said, "Oh, it's good to see that you stayed in the faith that you were that you were in as well, that you were raised in." He said, "Oh, it's not a faith." And John Lennox turns around and said, "Oh, but Peter, I was under the impression that you believed it." And it was hilarious, right? But he goes on and he talks to Amy Orr Ewing, and he said, before he started speaking with Peter, he said, "Peter, I don't share some of your views, and you come from," but he said, "I've read this book of yours," and he said, "and I want to recommend it to everybody, and I'm looking forward to a good discussion. It's this book," he said, "it does it." He said, "Actually, it's really good. I want to recommend that to everybody." After the talk, Peter Singer came up to John Lennox, and he said, "Thank you." And John said, "Oh, well, what for?" He said, "Well," he said, "I've never been treated that way with so much respect and humility from a Christian before."
Yeah.
And I tell you, I nearly wept.
Yeah.
Because I thought, what a lesson. And I'm going to have to go because I've got meetings, but I think that could be a good point to leave for me.
Yeah. Well, thank you. It was a very interesting talk and raised a lot of issues. I will just end the recording at this moment and just have a brief recording. Got to find out where it is.
I thought you'd ended it, actually.
No,
still going.
Okay. I have to go, folks. I got another